I notice changes. Olivia starts going out more often, saying she is meeting friends. Daniel also starts leaving home at unusual hours. I feel uneasy but still trust them. I talk with Olivia at night and ask, "Are you going out again?" She replies, "Yes, just with friends." I say, "You have been going out a lot lately." She smiles lightly and says, "Don't worry, Ethan." I study her face but she avoids my eyes. At work, I sit with Sarah Miller, my colleague. She says, "You look exhausted." I reply, "Family stuff." She asks, "Everything okay at home?" I say, "Yes, I think so." She leans forward and says, "When people change behavior, it's not random." I stay silent. That night I come home early. I hear voices in the kitchen. I stop and listen. Olivia and Daniel are talking softly. I open the door and they stop. Olivia says, "You are early." I reply, "What were you talking about?" She says, "Just nothing." Daniel looks away. I nod slowly. I feel something tighten inside me. Later I sit alone and think. Sarah's words echo in my mind. I whisper, "Am I imagining things?" I shake my head and say, "No, they are family." Next morning Mia asks, "Dad, will you come to my school event?" I say, "I will try." Olivia watches me carefully. Daniel eats silently. I ask, "Everything okay?" Daniel says, "Yeah." At office James Carter says, "We need better results." I reply, "I understand." He says, "Don't bring home stress here." I say, "I won't." But I already feel pressure building. That evening I see Olivia and Daniel again standing too close in the kitchen. I say, "What is going on?" Olivia replies, "Nothing, just talking." Daniel steps back. I feel pain but hide it. I walk away and whisper, "Maybe it's nothing." Olivia joins me later and says, "You seem distant." I reply, "Just tired." She says, "We are fine, right?" I say, "Yes." But I don't feel sure. I sit alone at night and think everything through. I remember every small detail. Daniel's silence feels heavier. Olivia's smile feels forced. I whisper, "Something is wrong." Sarah sits with me again next day. She says, "Ethan, you need to pay attention." I ask, "To what?" She says, "To patterns." I say, "What patterns?" She replies, "Distance, avoidance, silence." I stay quiet. She adds, "You can't fix what you ignore." I reply, "They are my family." She says, "And families hide things." I feel uncomfortable. That night I return home late. Olivia is in the kitchen. Daniel is there too. I stop and say, "Why are you always together lately?" Olivia says, "You are imagining things." Daniel says nothing. Silence hits harder. I step forward and say, "Tell me the truth." Olivia replies, "There is no truth to tell." I feel my chest tighten. I say, "I am not blind." Daniel looks at me briefly then away. I walk out. Later Olivia follows me into the room. She sits beside me and says, "Please stop this." I ask, "Stop what?" She says, "Doubting us." I say, "Then explain it." She pauses. Daniel is outside the door. He leaves. Olivia says, "You are hurting this family." I sit in silence while her words hang in the air. I say, "I am not doubting without reason." She replies, "There is no reason." I laugh bitterly. I say, "Then why does it feel like I am losing my own home?" She looks away. Daniel appears at the door again. He says, "Can we just stop?" I look at him and say, "Stop what?" He says, "All of this." Silence again. I stand and say, "I have been responsible for you since our parents died." Daniel looks down. I continue, "I gave everything to keep this family together." Olivia says, "And we know that." I ask, "Then why does it feel like I am the only one trying?" She does not answer. I breathe heavily. I whisper, "Tell me the truth." Daniel says, "There is nothing to tell." I step back. My hands shake. I say, "I see everything." Olivia stands quickly. She says, "No you don't." I look at both of them. I feel like I am standing in a house that no longer feels like mine. I whisper, "Something is breaking." Olivia walks closer and says, "Ethan, listen to me." I say, "I have been listening." She replies, "No you haven't." I shake my head. I say, "Every time I ask questions I get silence." Daniel says, "Because you don't trust us." I say, "Trust is earned." Olivia looks hurt. She says, "We are still your family." I reply, "Then act like it." Silence. I sit down again. My head feels heavy. I whisper, I don't know what is real anymore. Olivia looks at me and says, please? Daniel looks away again. I close my eyes for a moment. When I open them, I feel like I am standing on the edge of everything I believed in. You should stop doubting us, Ethan. It's hurting this family. I came home early from work and said, today felt wrong from the moment I woke up. The house was too quiet when I entered, so I called out, Mia? No answer came back. I stepped inside and said, where is everyone? My voice echoed. I walked to her room and opened the door slowly. I saw her sleeping and whispered, at least you are safe, sweetheart. I closed the door gently and said, just rest. I stood in the hallway and said, why does this place feel different today? Then I heard voices upstairs. I froze and said, who is that? I listened again and whispered, Olivia? Daniel? My heart tightened and I said, this is not normal. I tried to calm myself and said, maybe it's just a conversation. But the voices continued. I started walking toward the stairs and said, just check and come back down. Each step felt heavier and I whispered, please don't let this be what I think. I held the railing and said, it's probably nothing. But my chest disagreed. At the top of the stairs I stopped and said, why is the door half open? I stood still and whispered, should I even go in? Then I heard Olivia's voice again and said, that's enough for me to check. I pushed the door slowly and said, Olivia? Daniel? The room was dim and I stepped inside. My eyes locked on them and I said nothing for a moment. My mind went blank and I whispered, no, this cannot be real. I stepped back slightly and said, tell me what I am seeing. Olivia jumped up and said, Ethan, it's not what you think. Daniel said quickly, brother, listen to me. I raised my voice and said, no, you listen to me first. My hands started shaking and I said, in my house. Olivia said, please calm down. I replied, don't tell me to calm down. I looked at them and said, how long has this been going on? Silence filled the room. Daniel said, it's not like that. I cut him off and said, stop lying. Olivia said, we didn't mean to hurt you. I laughed once and said, you didn't mean to? Really? I stepped back and said, I trusted both of you with everything I had. Olivia reached out and said, Ethan, please don't do this. I moved away and said, don't touch me. My voice broke and I said, you both destroyed that trust. Daniel looked down and said, we can explain. I said, there is no explanation that fixes this. Olivia said, it's complicated. I replied, no, it is simple betrayal. I turned around and said, don't follow me. Olivia shouted, Ethan, wait, but I walked out of the room. I went down the stairs slowly and said, I don't recognize my own house anymore. I reached the front door and said, I need air. I opened it and stepped outside into the night. I sat on the ground and whispered, everything I built is gone in seconds. My hands were shaking and I said, why would you do this? I kept repeating, why? I said, I gave my whole life to this family. My phone rang and I looked at it. It was Olivia. I said, I can't answer you. It rang again and I said, stop calling me. Daniel texted me and I said, I don't want to read it. I put the phone down and said, nothing you say will fix this. I sat there longer and said, I feel like I don't even exist in my own life anymore. The street was silent and I said, everything I believed is broken. My phone rang again. I said enough and turned off. I said, silence is better than lies. I walked a few steps away and said, maybe I was never part of that family anymore. I stopped and said, or maybe I was replaced without knowing. I looked back once and whispered, I don't know who they are anymore. I pressed my hand to my chest and said, it hurts too much to even think. And I finally said, this is where everything ends for me tonight. I whispered finally, I didn't lose my wife that night. I lost myself. I started exposing small truths slowly, one piece at a time, and I said to myself, let's see how long they keep pretending. At breakfast I looked at Olivia and said, funny how some messages disappear so easily. She froze and said, what are you talking about? I replied, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Daniel shifted in his seat and said, this is getting uncomfortable. I looked at him and said, good, now you know how I've been feeling. Olivia tried to laugh it off. Ethan, you're imagining connections that don't exist. I said, then explain Richard Hale. Silence hit the table. Daniel's hand tightened on his glass and I noticed it. I said, so you do know him. Olivia snapped, stop this. Daniel suddenly said, you were never honest with him either. I leaned back and said, Interesting, now you're turning on each other. The air between them changed immediately. Olivia looked at Daniel and said, "You promised you wouldn't say anything." Daniel replied, "I didn't promise to take all the blame." I watched them and said, "So it wasn't just me you were hiding from?" Olivia said, "This is not what it looks like." I said, "It looks like betrayal has multiple owners." I contacted James Carter that same day and said, "I need financial separation planning." He replied, "You're serious now?" I said, "I've never been more serious." He said, "I'll handle the accounts quietly." I said, "No mistakes." He replied, "Understood." I hung up and said, "Now I control what I lose." Sarah met me later and said, "You're colder now." I replied, "I'm clear now." She said, "Cold clarity can scare people." I said, "Good, because they should be scared." She asked, "What are you planning?" I said, "Nothing emotional anymore." She said, "That's not like you." I replied, "That version of me got destroyed." At home, Olivia tried again. "Ethan, please, we can fix this." I looked at her and said, "Fix what exactly?" She said, "Us." I replied, "There is no us left to fix." Daniel interrupted, "You're tearing this family apart." I turned to him and said, "No, I'm revealing what was already broken." Olivia started crying. "I made mistakes, but I didn't mean to hurt you." I said calmly, "Intent doesn't erase impact." Daniel said, "She's suffering too." I replied, "So am I. The difference is I stopped begging." Olivia stepped forward and said, "Please don't do this." I shook my head and said, "I am not angry anymore. I am done." That sentence made them both silent. Daniel frowned and said, "What does that even mean?" I said, "It means I don't argue, I don't chase, I don't fix." Olivia whispered, "Ethan?" I said, "It means I've already left emotionally." Daniel said, "You're bluffing." I replied, "Try me." Mia started noticing everything. She looked at me one night and said, "Dad, why is everyone quiet all the time?" I knelt beside her and said, "Sometimes adults talk too much and fix nothing." She asked, "Are we okay?" I smiled gently and said, "You are okay. That's all that matters." Olivia watched from the hallway but said nothing. Daniel avoided eye contact completely. I started keeping Mia away from arguments. I said, "Go finish your homework, sweetheart." She said, "But you all are upset." I replied, "Not your burden." She nodded and left. I turned back and said, "She will not carry this." Olivia said softly, "She needs her parents together." I replied, "Then act like one." James updated me again. "Accounts are being separated cleanly," he said. I replied, "Good." He asked, "Any hesitation?" I said, "None left." He said, "Then you're already ahead." I said, "I intend to stay there." That night, Olivia confronted me again. "You're shutting us out completely." I said, "You did that first." Daniel said, "You're punishing everyone." I replied, "No, I'm protecting myself now." Olivia cried harder and said, "We can still fix this." I looked at her and said, "I am not angry anymore. I am done." Daniel stepped back and said, "That scares me more than anything you've said." I nodded and said, "It should." Silence filled the room. No one spoke for a long time. I could hear only the clock ticking and I said, "This is what peace sounds like after truth." Olivia whispered, "What happens now?" I said, "Now you live with what you created." Daniel said, "You're destroying everything." I replied, "No, I'm ending illusions." Mia walked in briefly and saw the tension. I smiled at her and said, "Go to bed, sweetheart." She looked confused but left quietly. I turned back and said, "She will not be part of this collapse." Later, I sat alone and said, "I am no longer reacting to anything." Sarah texted me, "Are you okay?" I replied, "I am beyond emotion now." She answered, "That's not peace." I said, "It's necessary distance." Olivia stood in the doorway and said, "You don't even look at me anymore." I replied, "There is nothing left to look at." Daniel said quietly, "This is killing us." I said, "No, it already died the moment truth entered." I stood up and said, "I am not angry anymore. I am done." They both stayed silent like they finally understood the weight of it. And in that silence, I saw everything collapse without a sound. The house was still standing but the family inside it was already dead. I started digging into Olivia's past after I couldn't ignore the patterns anymore. I said to myself, "I need answers." I searched quietly on her old contacts and found a name, Richard Hale. I whispered, "Who is Richard Hale?" I felt my chest tighten as I saw old messages hidden behind deleted folders. I said, Olivia, what did you hide? I kept reading until my hands shook and I said, this is not random. I called Daniel and said, did you know about Richard? He went silent, then said, it's not what you think. I replied, then explain it. He hung up. I met Sarah Miller that evening and said, I found a name from Olivia's past. She asked, what name? I said, Richard Hale. She went quiet, then said, Ethan, this is getting serious. I said, Daniel knew everything. She replied, that changes everything. I said, I feel like I never knew my own wife. She looked at me and said, you need proof, not emotions. I said, I don't have emotions left. She said, good, then use that clarity. I will help you. I said, what if it destroys everything? She replied, it already is destroyed, you just don't see it. Detective Brown met me at a quiet office and said, you want the truth? I said, I need confirmation, not guesses. He nodded and said, Olivia Blake had a past connection with Richard Hale that never fully ended. I felt my stomach drop and said, Daniel knew all along? He said, according to records, yes. I whispered, so I was the only one kept in the dark? He replied, it appears so. I stood up and said, how long? He said, years before your marriage and some overlap. I closed my eyes and said, so everything I built was inside a lie? He said, that's what evidence suggests. I laughed once and said, good, then I finally understand. Detective Brown slid a file toward me and said, there's more if you want it. I opened it and said, photos? He said, messages, travel logs, meeting records. I said, this is all connected. He replied, yes, and it always was, I just didn't see it before. I said, why tell me now? He said, because you asked for truth. I closed the file and said, truth feels heavier than lies. He said, it always does. I walked out of the office and said, I don't feel anything anymore. Sarah called me and said, what did they say? I replied, everything is worse than I thought. She said, are you okay? I said, no, but I am clear now. She said, clarity can hurt. I said, pain is better than confusion. I sat alone and said, I stopped crying today. She said, that is not good, Ethan. I said, it is necessary. I looked at the files again and said, now I see everything clearly. I remembered Olivia's face and said, she looked at me like I was blind. I whispered, Daniel was never honest. Sarah said, what will you do now? I said, I will stop reacting and start deciding. She said, that sounds dangerous. I said, it is necessary. I closed the file and said, I am done being the victim. I said softly, they thought I was weak. Sarah replied, they underestimated you. I nodded and said, that mistake will cost them everything. I went home and said, everything feels different now. Olivia looked at me and said, you are scaring me. I replied, good. Daniel said, this is not you. I said, it is the real me. Finally, Olivia said, we can fix this. I said, no, you cannot fix truth. I walked past them and said, I already know everything. Daniel said, you don't understand. I said, I understand enough. Olivia said, please listen. I opened the drawer and took the documents I had collected and said, every message, every lie, every pattern is here. Olivia said, why are you doing this? I said, because I stopped believing words. Daniel said, this will destroy us. I said, it was already destroyed before I walked in. Olivia cried, Ethan, please. I said, no more please. I stood still and said, I gave everything to this family. Daniel said, we know. I said, no, you didn't know anything. Olivia said, stop this. I said, I won't stop until truth is seen. I looked at both of them and said, there is no version of this where I stay silent. Olivia whispered, you are not yourself. I said, I am finally myself. Daniel stepped back and said, what do you want? I said, truth without filters. I stepped closer and said, everything you built around me is collapsing now. Olivia said, stop please. I said, I am already past stopping. Daniel said, this is madness now, Ethan. I stepped closer and said, everything you built lies. I would let truth burn them down. I gathered everyone in the living room and said, sit down. All of you. My voice was calm, almost too calm. Olivia looked at me and said, Ethan, what is this? I replied, it's the end of pretending. Daniel stayed silent, staring at the floor. I said, no one leaves until I finish speaking. Olivia's eyes were red. Please don't do this, she said. I replied, I already did it the moment I stopped lying to myself. Daniel said softly, you don't have to destroy everything. I looked at him and said, I'm not destroying anything. I'm revealing it. I opened the folder in my hand and said, every message, every pattern, every lie. I have it all. Olivia shook her head and said, why are you doing this? I replied, because I lived inside your silence long enough. Daniel said, it wasn't meant to go this far. I turned to him and said, but it did, because you let it. I looked at Olivia directly and said, you didn't just betray me. You destroyed the home I built for us. She broke down immediately and said, "I never wanted this." I replied, "Intent doesn't erase destruction." She whispered, "I'm sorry." I said, "Sorry doesn't rebuild trust." Daniel finally spoke. "I made mistakes too." I nodded and said, "You were my brother, but you chose to become my enemy." He looked up and said, "I never wanted to hurt you." I replied, "But you did anyway." The room went completely silent after that. No one argued. No one defended. Just truth sitting between us like something heavy and irreversible. I said, "This is not revenge. This is clarity." I called my lawyer the same night and said, "Prepare the separation documents." He replied, "Are you sure?" I said, "I've never been more sure." Olivia heard it and said, "Ethan, please?" I said, "It's already done." Daniel stood up and said, "I can't stay here." I replied, "Then don't." He walked out without looking back. Olivia stayed longer. She cried quietly and said, "We can fix this slowly." I looked at her and said, "Some things don't get fixed. They get accepted." She said, "I still love you." I replied, "Love without truth is just noise." She left that night. The house felt empty immediately. No shouting. No chaos. Just silence that finally made sense. I stood alone in the living room and said, "It's over." Months passed after that night. I didn't rush anything. I rebuilt piece by piece, starting with my own mind. Sarah stayed in contact and said, "You don't have to carry it all alone." I replied, "I'm not alone. I'm just focused." She said, "That's new you talking." I said, "It's the real me now." James helped me stabilize everything financially. I said, "I just want control over my life again." He replied, "You already started that process." I said, "I just needed the truth first." He nodded and said, "Now build on it." Mia slowly became my center again. One night she asked, "Dad, are we okay now?" I smiled and said, "We are safe." She said, "What about Happy?" I paused and said, "Happy comes later." She hugged me and said, "I missed you." I replied, "I never left you." That moment reminded me why I had to survive everything. Olivia was no longer in my life. Daniel had disappeared completely. I didn't chase either of them. I let silence do what it was supposed to do. Sarah once asked, "Do you regret anything?" I said, "I regret believing blindly." She said, "And now?" I replied, "Now I see everything clearly." She said, "Does it hurt less?" I said, "It hurts differently." I looked at my life slowly rebuilding. Not perfect, not whole, but mine again. I said, "I am not the same man anymore." Sarah nodded and said, "That's the point." I realized I was no longer defined by what broke me. I was defined by what I survived. One evening, I stood alone after putting Mia to bed and said quietly to myself, "I am no longer the man who believed blindly." I took a breath and looked at the quiet house I had rebuilt from ashes. And I finally said, "They broke my home, but they never broke me." I don't confront them immediately. I start acting normal. I become silent, cold, observant. Olivia notices my change. She tries to talk, but I avoid her. Daniel avoids me completely. I start planning my next steps. I contact James Carter, my business friend, for emotional and financial advice. Sarah becomes my emotional support. She tells me, "Now you have to think smart, not emotional." I start collecting proof quietly. Messages, patterns, financial records. Olivia becomes nervous. Daniel starts thinking I don't know anything. But I know everything now. They thought I was broken, but I was just preparing. At night I sit alone in my room and think about everything. I whisper, "This is not over." Sarah calls me and asks if I am okay. "Are you really okay, Ethan?" she says. I reply, "I am managing." "You don't sound like it," she says. I say, "I just need time." She replies, "Time doesn't fix betrayal, planning does." I stay silent for a moment. Then I say, "I am already planning." At the office, James Carter calls me into his cabin. "You look different," he says. I reply, "I am focused." "Focused or broken?" he asks. I say, "There is no difference anymore." He leans back and says, "What happened?" I say, "I found out enough." "About your family?" I nod and say, "Yes." He says, "Then you need control, not emotion." I reply, "That is what I am building." I leave his office and walk outside. Olivia tries calling me again. I ignore the call. Daniel sends me a message, "We need to talk." I delete it without reading. I say, "Not yet." Sarah meets me in the evening. You are shutting down, she says. I reply, I am focusing. Focusing on revenge? She asks. I say, on truth. She says, truth needs patience. I say, I have patience now. At home, Olivia waits for me in the kitchen. She says, we need to talk. I say, we already talked too much. She steps closer and says, you are destroying us. I reply, no, I am exposing what is already broken. She looks shocked and says, you don't understand. I say, then explain it. I start saving every message I find. I take screenshots quietly. I note down every pattern. I say to myself, now I have everything. Sarah says, now you are thinking correctly. I reply, now I am not emotional anymore. She says, that is dangerous too. I say, I can handle dangerous. At night I look at everything again. Olivia asks, why are you so distant? I say, you already know why. Daniel says, you are overreacting. I reply, no, I am finally reacting. She says, this is destroying everything. I say, it was already destroyed. I sit alone and think for hours. I whisper, I am not the same anymore. I hear Olivia talking to Daniel again. I stay outside the room and listen silently. I say, I know what I need to do. I gather my documents and phone records. I say, no more waiting. I prepare myself mentally for the truth. Sarah calls and says, are you safe? I reply, I am already past fear. She says, that scares me. I say, it should. I walk through the house slowly at night. I whisper, this is no longer my home. Olivia says, where are you going? I say, somewhere you cannot follow. Daniel says, don't do this. I reply, you already did it. I stop at the door and look back. I say, everything I built is gone. I feel my hands shaking. I whisper, I can't breathe in this house. Sarah says over phone, leave if you must. I say, not yet. I walk outside again into the cold air. I whisper, no more noise. I walk back home slowly and stop at the gate. I look at the house and feel nothing familiar anymore. I stand there and say, this is not my home anymore. I hear silence from inside and it feels heavier than anything. I whisper, everything I knew is gone. I take a step back from the gate. I say, I cannot go back inside as the same person. I close my eyes and breathe slowly. I whisper, I am changing into someone I don't know. I open my eyes and look at the house again. I say, this is where everything ended for me. I turn away slowly from everything I knew. I walk down the empty street without looking back. I say, I am not the same man anymore. I feel the weight of everything collapsing inside me. I whisper, there is no going back now. I stop walking and stand still in the dark. I say, everything I believed is gone now. I realize my entire life has been rewritten without my knowledge now completely. They thought I was broken, but I was just preparing tonight. I start by describing my peaceful life. My name is Ethan Blake and I live with my wife Olivia Blake, my daughter Mia Blake and my younger brother Daniel Cross in a middle-class home. Everything looks normal at first glance. I believe my life is stable and blessed. I trust Olivia completely and treat Daniel like my responsibility after our parents died. I talk about my daily routine, job stress, and how Olivia always smiles at me when I return home. Daniel is quiet but respectful, or so I think. I feel proud that I kept my family together. But small signs appear. Olivia hides her phone sometimes. Daniel avoids eye contact when Olivia is near. I ignore it, calling it normal family behavior. My mornings always start early because of work pressure. I work long hours at the office, dealing with constant deadlines. My boss James Carter keeps pushing new targets every week. Sometimes I come home exhausted and barely speak. But Olivia always greets me with a warm smile. She says, you look tired, Ethan. Did work go hard again? I reply, it's nothing, just usual stress. At dinner, Mia talks about school while Daniel quietly eats. Mia always asks, Dad, will you come to my school event? I tell her, I will try, sweetheart. Daniel rarely joins conversations, keeping his head down. Sometimes I notice Olivia watching Daniel when she thinks I am not looking. I brush it off as imagination. Still, a strange feeling begins to grow inside me. I tell myself everything is fine. One evening, I come home earlier than usual. The house feels unusually silent. I hear soft voices coming from the kitchen. I pause and listen carefully. It sounds like Olivia and Daniel talking quietly. My heart beats faster, but I tell myself it's nothing. I open the door and see them stop talking immediately. Olivia smiles nervously and says, "Hey, you're home early." Daniel looks away quickly. I ask, "What were you two talking about?" Olivia replies, "Just family things, nothing important." I nod, but something inside me feels wrong. I sit down and try to relax. But Daniel avoids sitting near Olivia. I notice it clearly this time. I ask myself why they act like this. I decide not to think too much about it. Later that night, I stand in the hallway alone. I whisper to myself, maybe I'm just overthinking. But deep down, I feel something shifting in my life. I walk to the kitchen for water. The lights are dim and the house is quiet. I see Olivia's phone on the counter. It lights up with a message, but I don't look. I tell myself I shouldn't invade her privacy. I turn away and pour myself water. But the silence feels heavier than usual. I think about Daniel and Olivia again. Something about their behavior doesn't sit right with me. I decide to ask Daniel tomorrow. But I already feel the answer might hurt me. I go to my room and close the door. I sit on the bed and stare at the ceiling. I remember the promise I made to my parents before they died. Take care of Daniel and keep the family together. I whispered that promise again tonight. I won't let anything break us. But even as I say it, doubt grows stronger. I close my eyes and try to sleep. But my mind keeps replaying every small detail. In the morning, I act normal at breakfast. Me as cheerful as always. She says, "Dad, will you really come this time?" I smile and say, "I promise I'll try harder." Olivia watches me carefully during breakfast. I feel her eyes but don't ask why. Daniel arrives late and sits quietly. No one speaks for a few seconds. I break the silence and say, "Everything okay?" Olivia replies quickly, "Yes, just tired." Daniel nods but doesn't look at me. I feel the distance between us growing. But I still convince myself it's nothing serious. I leave for work with a heavy heart. On the way, I think about Olivia and Daniel again. I wonder if I'm losing control of my own home. But I push the thought away. I tell myself work is the only thing I can control. I arrive at the office and sit at my desk. James Carter calls me into a meeting almost immediately. He says, "Ethan, we need results faster this month." I nod and reply, "I'm doing my best." But my mind is still at home. I keep thinking about Olivia and Daniel's strange distance. I feel like something important is slipping away from me. I cannot shake this uneasy feeling all day long inside. I had no idea my perfect world was already breaking, right under my feet. I started watching everything more carefully now. I studied Daniel's behavior every time he left the house. "Where are you going?" I asked him one morning. He replied, "Just out with friends." I said, "Which friends?" He shrugged and said, "Why do you care so much?" That answer stayed in my mind longer than I expected. I also noticed Olivia on her phone more often, her fingers moving fast before she turned the screen away. Once I asked, "Who are you texting?" She said, "Work stuff, Ethan." But I saw her delete something right after. "It's nothing important," she added quickly. At night, I lay awake thinking about everything. I whispered to myself, "Am I becoming paranoid?" Then I answered myself, "No. I am just noticing things I ignored before." One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, but I heard voices in the living room. I slowly stepped closer and saw Olivia and Daniel sitting too close on the sofa. When they saw me, they separated quickly. "You're home early," Olivia said. Daniel stood up immediately. I said, "What were you two talking about?" Olivia replied, "Just random things." Daniel added, "Yeah, nothing serious." I stared at them and said nothing for a moment. I tried to laugh it off. "Why do I feel like I interrupted something?" I said lightly. Daniel laughed and said, "You always think too much." Olivia's face tightened. "Ethan, stop this. You're becoming insecure," she said sharply. That word hit me harder than I expected. I replied, "I'm just asking questions." She said, "Questions that don't need to be asked." I walked away feeling strange. My chest felt heavy, but I told myself I was overthinking again. Still, something inside me didn't settle. At work the next day, I met Sarah Miller. She looked at me and said, "You look exhausted again." I replied, "Family stuff." She asked, "Still?" I nodded. She leaned back and said, "Ethan, when people start hiding small things, it always grows into something bigger." I said, "You don't know my family." She replied softly, "Maybe not. But I know patterns." Her words stayed with me the whole day. But I refused to accept them. That night I confronted Olivia again. "Are you hiding something from me?" I asked. She looked shocked. "What kind of question is that?" she replied. I said, "A simple one." Daniel interrupted, "You're being unfair." I said, "Then explain what I keep seeing." Olivia raised her voice, "You're imagining things. You always do this when you're stressed." I went silent. I felt guilt rising inside me. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I really was imagining it. I said softly, "I don't want to fight." Olivia's tone softened. "Then stop doubting us," she said. Daniel nodded. But that night I couldn't sleep again. I kept replaying everything. The deleted messages. The sudden silence. The way they always stopped talking when I entered. I whispered, "Something is not right." The next morning, everything felt normal again. Olivia made breakfast. Daniel acted casual. But I could feel a distance I couldn't explain. At breakfast I asked, "Are we okay?" Olivia smiled slightly and said, "Of course we are." Daniel said, "Why wouldn't we be?" I looked at both of them and forced a smile. "Just asking," I said. But inside I was breaking a little more. Later I met Sarah again. She asked, "Did you talk to them?" I said, "Yes." She asked, "And?" I said, "They say I'm overthinking." She looked at me and said, "And do you believe them?" I hesitated. That silence answered everything. She said, "Ethan, ignoring signs doesn't erase them." I replied, "They are my family." She said, "And families can still lie." I left without replying. That evening I came home and saw something that made my stomach tighten again. Olivia and Daniel were sitting close on the couch again. They quickly moved apart. "We were just talking," Olivia said immediately. Daniel added, "About school stuff." I said nothing at first. Then I said, "Why do you always stop talking when I enter?" Olivia stood up and said, "Because you make everything uncomfortable lately." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Daniel said, "You need to relax, brother." I replied, "Relax about what exactly?" Silence followed. Olivia walked toward me and said, "Ethan, this is getting out of control." I said, "Or maybe I'm finally seeing control being taken from me." She shook her head. "That's not true." But I felt something shifting inside me. A crack I couldn't ignore anymore. I stood there for a long time after they left the room. I whispered, "I don't know what's real anymore." And for the first time I felt like my home was not mine anymore. I stood still in the hallway, unable to move as everything I believed in felt unstable. I heard Olivia and Daniel talking quietly again behind the closed door, and I did not knock. I told myself I needed proof, but I was afraid of what I might find. Sarah's words echoed in my mind, and I finally admitted that I was losing control. I whispered, "I cannot ignore this anymore," but I still did not know what to do next. Everything felt like it was slipping away from me slowly and painfully inside my own home. Something inside me refused to break yet.